Well, hi. This is podcast 21. It's about slavery. Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude shall exist within the United States or any place subject to its jurisdiction, is what the Constitution says. It gives every human being living in the United States and its territories the right to be free. The Civil War took place in the 1860s. The northern and southern states had problems for years in Congress. Even Washington and Jefferson knew slavery was a hot topic that needed attention, but the country needed to be established first. So they did what they could do in freeing their own slaves back in the 1780s. Jefferson gave homes to his slaves and kept their families intact. He fed them, he educated them along with his own family. Washington did very similar, and his best friend was a black man who he grew up with on his plantation and who helped him during the Revolutionary War. There were states like Vermont that declared every man free in their state long before the 13th Amendment. In the 1860s, the difference economically and socially between the North and the South was obvious. And the Civil War you all know about. And it did help to bring about and cause to be put in place the Emancipation Proclamation by Abraham Lincoln. But the Emancipation Proclamation came from the president, not Congress. And it was only targeted to the states that were trying to secede from the Union. That's why the 13th Amendment in 1865 was needed to clarify and to make into law that slavery was no longer to be tolerated in the United States. However, I want to approach the 13th Amendment from a different angle than just the Civil War. The mentality of slavery has a deep ingrained attitude taught by words and innuendos as well as actions. My parents were good, kind people. They came from families who had lived in the northern United States and migrated to Utah. They, however, had feelings against mixed marriages and friendships associations with blacks. They believed slavery was wrong, but they still called Brazil nuts nigger toes, which was still one of those negative innuendos. My father was a businessman and he met many people. As he got older, he associated with many black people and learned to embrace them as true friends. However, my mother didn't have these opportunities and still had strong reservations being around and even shaking hands with blacks. My parents had a financial setback and had to move to manage a downtown block of homes for the owner before he tore them down for new development. Several homes were rented by black families. My mother got to talk to the women often when she was collecting the rent. She taught two of them how to crochet. She shared recipes with them and even babysat a few times for them. She learned to love these lifelong friends. Segregation never built a nation. The basic understanding that all humans are a child of God or created equal sounded great to the people as they thought about how it applied to them, but it didn't carry over into their thoughts of the slaves. We still have all this to some degree today. What are your thoughts when you see a woman dressed in her hijab clothing from the Middle East? Or when you see a poor Spanish speaking family? Or a teenager high on drugs? I agree we need to make initial judgments when we first see someone to make a decision whether it's safe or we need to distance ourselves. But do we really need to be so guarded that we miss the whole concept of being created equal? Another side to this is the mentality of a slave. In Viktor Frankl's book, Man's Search for Meaning, he talks about his time in a German concentration camp in World War II. There were a few older men that would every day go to the sick and severely depressed and try to cheer them up and even share a half a slice of bread with them sometimes. Most of the men were quiet and stayed to themselves. When the Americans came and liberated them, the gates and the locks were opened, and they were told they were free to go. Some ran to the gates of the camp and just left, and many ran to the gates and just stopped. They didn't know where to go. Which way was home? Could they trust the outside world? Was home still home? Where was their family? Did anyone still love them? This is so familiar to the 13th Amendment. It unlocked the gates and set all men free. But where were they to go? How were they to live in a country that overnight says you are free, but still won't let your children be educated? They won't let them ride on the front of the bus or drink out of the same water fountain. How do you find a place to go and raise a family and get a good job to support them? They could leave. They still had but they couldn't leave. They still had the slave way of thinking, and so did the whole country. 80 years after that, the 13th Amendment, after the 13th Amendment came about, before things started to change, it took 80 years for people like Martin Luther King to help slave mentality to realize that they were equal. They realized they needed an education to complete jobs. They needed to be heard and seen as contributors to the American society. The Civil War had Uncle Tom's Cabin, which was written by a white woman, oddly enough. And they had Harriet Tubman and the Underground Railroad to inspire the abolitionists. So 80 years later, by the 1860s, we had Martin Luther King and John F. Kennedy influencing the blacks to speak out to better themselves, and we will talk more about this in the next two amendments. We are now another 60 years later, and the created equal thought has become a form of I deserve it all because of my ancestors or because I am a minority. Let it be known, the American natives, the blacks, the Mexicans, and the whites are all created equal and should be respected as equals, as a child of God, as a brother and a sister. Slavery is alive and well in some other countries in the world, and it has become a worldwide problem with human trafficking cells. The justification for this is beyond my understanding. It is so evil. It takes away someone's freedom physically, and then they brainwash them into slavery mentally, and then they create fear in them. There are reports in major cities in the United States that have detention locations for kidnapped people to get ready to sell. Yes, here in America. In Utah, the story of Elizabeth Smart being taken and then kept for several months before she finally made contact with someone to help her. She had all freedoms taken. She was in fear and punished for any words and actions not in compliance with her captors. She was a teenager when she was taken. She, however, had been taught as a child that she was a child of God and how to pray to Him. They may have taken her freedoms, but they couldn't take her thoughts and beliefs. It took a lot of effort for her to find a sense of being herself again, but she did, and she overcame the physical and mental slavery she had been exposed to. In American history, we have early Englishmen who had white and black slaves. The Irish immigrants were treated shamefully. The Japanese, who were Americans, were put in concentration camps here in the United States during World War II. the poor American natives were forced out of their lands and treated inhumanely. I had some German families live in our church ward in Salt Lake City in the 1950s. They had thick accents and were treated poorly by a few members in our ward because of World War II memories. Mother encouraged me to befriend a daughter from each of these families and to bring them to our home to play with. They are some of my fondest childhood memories. Wartime generates hasty generalizations about people as a whole, and we forget they are individuals, good people, created equal to us. All of this is because people feared them, didn't understand their cultures, and forgot they were created equal too. To stop slavery and slave mentality, we need to learn about other lands and cultures and religions so we are not afraid of them. That is why I started Scrapbook for each of my children's families. I wanted them to be familiar with the pages from these countries that would carry on so they can carry on conversations with people about something wonderful from their land. I wanted them to help create in my childhood's minds a positive thought when they met someone different. We need to be kind to others. We need to learn to look all mankind in the eye and smile. Then and only then will true freedom be available to everyone. May God be with you till we meet again.